This is the slightly more than 5-minute guide to the G3 class, never-built battlecruisers of the British Royal Navy.
Right, so the G3 class. They're a very interesting design in and of themselves, but also what led up to them, and unusually for a cancelled class, what they led to is quite interesting. So as a result, this video will be a bit more than the usual length. At the end of World War I, the Royal Navy faced a little bit of a problem. The last battleships that it had built were the Queen Elizabeth class and their slightly cheaper Revenge class cousins. But whereas from the Dreadnought through to the Revenge, they had built a new class of battleship every year, with gradual improvements incorporated over time and obviously a steady build-up of numbers, all that had stopped with the outbreak of World War I. No battleship to a design that post-dated 1913 had been laid down, and the only real capital ships built since then had been the Renown class, which were thrown together from spare parts of two Revenge class that had never been built, and the Hood, which was the lead ship of the Admiral class battlecruisers. But the Renowns had needed to be pulled in for extra armour, and the Hood had been radically redesigned whilst under construction as a result of the Battle of Jutland. And as it turned out, the design changes made were so radical that the rest of the Admiral class were cancelled, as it would be more efficient to do a new design from scratch, especially since it was now 3 years on from the finalising of the original Admiral class design. Meanwhile, overseas, although Russia was in the midst of a revolution and France had slipped to a definitive second-class naval power status, and of course Germany's high seas fleet was now either at the bottom of Scapa Flow or in the scrapyard, there were still two major naval powers that had come out of the war stronger than when they went in: Japan and the USA. Japan was largely unaffected by the war and had added the four Kongo-class battlecruisers as well as the Fuso and Ise-class battleships to its roster, and was in the process of building the Nagato class. Likewise, the Americans, although having committed more resources than the Japanese, were still nowhere near as affected as the UK, and had added half a dozen standard-class battleships to its roster, and was in the process of building the Colorados. All these ships had been built whilst the UK had built nothing in response, and whilst a Queen Elizabeth class could arguably stand toe-to-toe with an Ise or a Tennessee, there was no way of arguing the case against a Colorado or a Nagato, save perhaps that the Colorado was slow enough to run away from. So both of these navies had now expanded and had a lot of newer ships in service, and except for the fact that the Queen Elizabeth and Revenge classes were larger in number than individual classes from other nations, the bulk of the Royal Navy was made up of older 12-inch and 13.5-inch armed ships. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. The British had access to some remaining German ships and their technology, and it had the greatest amount of naval wartime experience. So they decided to make a clean break with the iterative design process and combine all their new and acquired knowledge into a new class of battleship and a new class of battlecruiser. This was important because once you took the older ships out of the equation, the Royal Navy was actually disturbingly close to numerical parity, far closer than it had been in over a century, and if the American building program kept going, that gap was only going to narrow. It looked like a new naval arms race was about to begin, as both the UK and America were determined to have the largest navy, and the British at the same time were looking to set back foreign ambitions as they had done with the Warrior in 1860 and the Dreadnought in 1906. The designs for the battlecruisers started off with the designations K2 and K3, whilst the battleships started with L2 and L3. This was a quick shorthand to reflect that one of the big decisions was whether to go with twin or triple turrets. Each letter indicated a broadly similar hull and protection layout, whilst the numbers showed the difference in turrets and upper layout. Now, K2 and K3 were actually vaguely sane versions of Admiral Fisher's earlier HMS Incomparable designs. These were absolutely monstrous vessels, designed somewhat like upscaled Admiral class, except armed with either 4 twin or 3 triple 18-inch guns. Their speed, size, and firepower would not be equalled in reality until the Yamato class, but their sheer size restricted where they could dock, and the engine technology of the time meant that if you put decent armour on them, they could make only 30 knots, which, given the proposed speed of the Lexington class, was not seen as acceptable. What was established during this exercise, however, was that triple turrets were preferred. The Royal Navy had not used these until this point, but the extra gun and shorter citadel you could get with 3 triples as opposed to 4 twins was a huge advantage at the scales of ship now being considered. The next design, J3, scaled things down by about 10,000 tons and ended up looking a bit like a prototype Littorio, with three triple 15-inch turrets and the rear unit mounted high in the superfiring position. But at only 43,000 tons, this firepower was not considered sufficient. The I-3 took the design in another direction, putting the third turret immediately behind the bridge and all the engines at the back. This was armed with 9 18-inch guns and would be smaller and displace less, albeit not by that much, compared to the K3, but this allowed it to dock at far more locations. To try and bring displacement down and docking opportunities up, the H3 designs played around with dropping one of the turrets in a variety of ways, with a total of 6 18-inch guns in similar locations to the I3. But 6 guns was considered too few, and finally they had to drop the idea of an 18-inch armed battlecruiser. The principle of the I3 design, however, was revisited, but scaled down to 16.5-inch guns, and this resulted in the first G3 proposal. Some final design tweaks lowered the power of the engines and the size of the guns to 16 inches, and by early 1921 the final design had been arrived at. This ship had 3 triple 16-inch turrets, 2 superfiring forward and 1 pointing aft but positioned right behind the bridge superstructure. These guns would use a slightly lighter shell with a higher muzzle velocity than normal. Secondary guns would consist of 16 6-inch guns, all in superfiring pairs of twin turrets. The anti-aircraft battery would consist of 6 single 4.7-inch guns, backed up by 4 8-barrel 2-pounder or 40mm batteries. And finally 2 underwater torpedo tubes, 1 per side, were included because why not? 160,000 horsepower coming out of the engines gave the ships a design top speed of 32 knots, making them faster than any capital ship then in service or under design except for the Lexingtons. Another break with the old design tradition was the change to all-or-nothing armour layouts. By concentrating the main battery, this ostensible battlecruiser was able to carry a main belt 14 inches thick, angled at 18 degrees, superior armour by a significant margin to any battleship then in service. On a battlecruiser. And again, not protection that was to be exceeded in real life until the Yamato class. Looking towards longer range engagements, the deck armour was stupidly thick, at 8 inches maximum over the most vital areas. A final interesting feature was the torpedo defence system. The outer defence space was air-filled, the inner space was water-filled, but was fitted with a compressed air system, the idea being that if the outer layer was flooded by a torpedo hit, the inner layer could be filled with air, somewhat like a submarine's ballast tank, bringing the ship back up to buoyancy. The end result was a ship that, had it have been built, would have been more heavily armed, armoured, and faster than any battleship built until the Yamato itself, and even then it would have been faster than Yamato. Even the Iowa, which would have matched its guns and its speed, was actually less well protected. And if you think that's bad, wait until we cover the N3, the battleship counterpart to the G3. I would think it's safe to say that the G3s represented by far the best battlecruiser design of the period, albeit that they did so by effectively abandoning the old concept and making themselves genuine fast battleships. There is still some debate as to what the ships would have been called, with some suggestions that they would have been named after the 4 patron saints of Great Britain, that is, St George, St Andrew, St David and St Patrick. Others suggesting they would have taken up the names of the cancelled Admiral class ships with one extra addition, so that would have been Anson, Howe, Rodney, and presumably Nelson. In the end, though, the Washington Naval Treaty saw the ships cancelled mere weeks after they were laid down. But their legacy didn't quite end there. Because the Colorado and Nagato classes were under construction, the British were allowed to have a pair of 35,000-ton ships armed with 16-inch guns under the Washington Naval Treaty. The lessons of the G3 and N3 designs were grouped, scaled down, and the O3 design was developed, which became the Nelson class. Of particular note were the guns. Now, although with the turret and mounting design lightened somewhat significantly compared to the G3s, these would effectively be the same actual weapons, and they equipped the Nelson class. And on the HMS Rodney, these would be the guns that pretty much killed the Bismarck some 2 decades later. Something of a fitting final legacy for ships that never even saw the water.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below.